Welcome pals to a new video. Today, I wanted to cover a little bit of a deep dive into the evolution of Insignia's dialogue system. A couple of weeks ago, I did a video about Insignia as a project and how that's kind of evolved and the tools that I've built to manage it and things like that. And you guys responded really well to it. So I thought today we would go into more specifics into one system, hence the dialogue system. This has been a really interesting system to develop. I'm quite proud of the code side of it. But I think the interesting story on this is kind of how the visual design for the actual UI has changed as the project's gotten bigger. So I want to talk you through those considerations and kind of how I got where I am today. All right, shall we get into it? Let's go. Okay, so evolution of a dialogue system. I guess the first thing we should ask before we go down this road on Insignia's path here is just like what a dialogue system is. For those of you who aren't super clued in, a dialogue system is really just what we refer to when we're talking about the way that the game presents spoken text to the player. Now, I say spoken text and not just character dialogue because sometimes there are situations where the game is speaking to the player through tutorials or pop-ups, stuff like that. When it uses the same system, and this is common in a lot of games. So specifically RPGs, anything with a tutorial that's quite lengthy, it's common to use typed text that actually plays out, that you can skip through and press A to proceed through. It's common to use those systems for more than just characters talking to each other, although characters talking to each other is kind of like the primary thing here. This is Insignia's prototype dialogue system. This was kind of before the game even existed as a game. I was applying for PAX in 2017, the Australia edition of PAX. And in order to apply for a space on the indie side of the show floor, you had to show some screenshots of your game and a website and stuff like that. Now, I didn't have anything, so I needed to cobble together the art assets that I had into a series of screenshots that felt like it was from a diverse game with lots of systems. And this was what I produced for the screenshots for the game. It's using a font that I picked up from somewhere online, and the system itself was actually something that I did design. So I stuck with this for about a year or two after I developed this. So you can see here, like, what have we got? We've got like a text field with a nice background that looks like a book. We've got two character portraits. In this context, we've actually got characters raising and lowering, depending on who's speaking. And the person who's speaking's in full opacity, whereas the person who's not is in like semi-transparent. My goals for this were a few different things. One, I wanted there to be portraits. Not every system needs portraits, but I wanted there to be portraits. I wanted for there to be a kind of, we call it skeuomorphic. It's basically something that looks like a real object or works like a real object. So the idea of pages, bookmarks, it was going to kind of be like an analogy for Armin, the main character, almost like writing in his diary about conversations that he had. So I was pretty happy with this. Notably, however, I just want to flag, like, one feature about this system that was pretty apparent pretty quickly is the fact that there is a line right through the middle of the screen. Everything below this is taken up by the dialogue system. And so I needed to do a little bit of playing around with the camera in order to make this work. So whenever there's a conversation, the camera dips down, which pushes all of the on-screen content up, which creates negative space down the bottom for the dialogue system to inhabit. And that was pretty functional for quite some time. Even up until, I think this is 2018, mid 2018, late 2018. You can see there are some changes here. I've added my own font, and I've got the name of the character here as well, which is pretty obvious that you would want to do that. I've also got a little button prompt. Z is the button that you press to proceed through the dialogue. And that's there for a couple of reasons. One, it tells you that you can continue, right? It tells you the dialogue's finished playing. And it prompts you to actually press the button to do that. This is the third iteration. And there are a couple of obvious things here. One is that we've moved the name and the portrait to the sides. Now, of course, eventually the 50% of the screen thing caught up with me. And I wasn't really happy with the way that it was creating such a constraint for the game. There was a point when I kind of got frustrated. I was designing this cutscene for just before a fight with the first boss. And the first boss was going to be a giant spider. And sort of like the Bowser fight in Super Mario Bros. 3, there were going to be these planks along the floor, and the spider would land on the planks, and they would rumble and break. And I wanted for the dialogue system in the beginning of this scene to show off a little more of that. I mean, right now, if we cut off half of the screen, you can't see the hole in the floor, you can't see anything. So this was frustrating me a little bit, and I decided, okay, let's just draw over a screenshot here and see what we can come up with. You can see pretty quickly I worked out you could just pull the bookmark to the side, and that gives you more space immediately. But I was struggling a little bit to kind of come up with a metaphor where the bookmark would still work from the side of the book. So you can see here, maybe, we have a script that's not a book, but just a series of loose leaf papers. Maybe the dialogue sits in the middle and the characters sit either side. Maybe we still have the book with the characters in front of the book and not a bookmark. There were a few, I guess, competing considerations here, trying to preserve what I had in the beginning, but trying to maximize utility and space. Of course, I was aware of other games. You can see here there's a few different ways that different popular games have approached this challenge. Some of these systems allow for dialogue to be placed arbitrarily on screen, some of them pinned to the bottom, and there are differences between them as to whether or not there are portraits. So you can see in the case of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance and Tactics Ogre that these characters, being as small as they are, warrant there to be nice, clear portraits. It's much easier to see what this character's thinking or how their expression is if you can see a portrait, and I value that quite a lot. But in games like Iconoclasts, the actual expression of the characters is left to the animation of the character sprites. For me, as a designer who's working solo, I thought it would be worth making a judicious decision about whether or not I wanted to go through the effort of animating all of the characters emoting like that. And at the end of the day, I was still committed to the idea that doing the portraits would save me time because they would be more reusable. And it would mean that more characters could get those expressions out. So I compromised and I ended up somewhere here. And you can see here, I've still got the bookmark. We've actually got two pieces of paper now. We've got like the book behind and then a loose leaf on the front that's kind of in the middle that's straddling those two pages. Part of the reason here is that if we wanted the dialogue to run across this space without this piece of paper, we're actually running along the spine of the book, which doesn't make much sense because you don't write across pages like that. So this was kind of a bit of a compromise. It's nice in that now we're looking at about 30% of the screen rather than 50. But still, there are still some constraints here. Incidentally, around this time, I started to come up against the idea that actually, it would be useful to use this system for tutorials. So I came up with this additional viewport for the dialogue system. Effectively, it's the same system. It uses the same way of ticking through the letters. It uses the same way of proceeding to the next line of dialogue. And these are still event sequences, so it's still using the same backend, but the front end is more limited. The features of this are, it can only have one line of dialogue, and I can actually place it anywhere that I want to on screen. That's the important thing here, is being able to actually just move this box around to make way for things that appear in different parts of the screen. And in this context, the menu is actually moving on its own, right? Pages are turning, little, items are being selected and things are happening as the game is showing the player how to use this. And finally, there was actually a third way that I wanted to show dialogue. Again, same backend, same constraints for the most part in terms of the features, but in this context, I actually wanted this system to allow characters to talk to each other in a way that didn't require the gameplay to stop. So up until this point, every conversation that could happen in the game, every line of dialogue in the game required the system to pop up and gameplay to stop. In this context, what I wanted was for characters to be talking to each other. And if the characters aren't talking to the main character, then why does the gameplay need to stop? So that was the idea. And what I came up with was this kind of like messenger system, right? It's kind of like a messenger on Facebook or on a phone or anything like that, where the two characters would be having their dialogue kind of like go in this little vertical list. And they would start conversations when you walked past them, and they would fade away when you left the space. And this is what I called Popup Dialogue. So now we have three front ends for the same back end. And it remained like this for quite some time. This was in the game from 2018 until a couple of months ago, or this month, basically. And the final iteration is what I use today. This one is version 3. And I just want to talk about kind of how we got here. So in July, I was doing a little bit of budgeting on the amount of portraits that I would have to do for all of the characters in chapter 2. I was starting to get to the point where I wanted to be able to walk through the second chapter of the game and talk to all of the characters and actually have the story play out. And I was realizing, hey, in my system, every character who talks needs a portrait, because that's just the way the system is designed. So the more characters I have, the more portraits I have to create, and the more the workload increases. And in chapter 2, the amount of characters with speaking dialogue were double, triple chapter 1. So I started to think about, like, okay, how many would the whole game require? And it was in the hundreds of portrait sprites. And I was like, well, this isn't going to work. So I sought a solution that would allow me to maybe just somehow not require a portrait for every dialogue. And also, if I could, free up some screen real estate once more. So I was starting to do some pros and cons, right? And I returned back to that screenshot list of other games, and I was thinking, okay, do I do away with portraits? Do I make the portraits bigger? I like the portraits. I want to know who's talking, and I appreciate the value that they create. So we were sort of doing a bit of a pros and cons list here. And I started prototyping as well. So I started to think, like, what would the game look like if I used that Owlboy iconoclast's way of presenting dialogue? You know, how streamlined could I make this? And I came up with a few different iterations here. You can see I'm just mocking up, right? I just took a screenshot of the game and started drawing over it. So yeah, this was looking pretty good. I was quite comfortable with some of these options. And I really liked the idea that the less text there was on screen, the less that I actually needed to show. So the system that I had currently up to this point was basically requiring every line of dialogue to take up that third of the screen, right? And in scenes like this, where we're working with height a lot more, we might have a character standing up here and a character down here. It's hard to just assume that cutting off the bottom third is going to give us the screen real estate we need to actually show what we're trying to show in a cinematic way. So I liked this, but I still wanted to work the portraits back in. Like, how could I get the best of both worlds? And here you can see I'm trying this idea where I actually just like replace the character with the portrait, almost like we're doing like a close-up shot of the character that's just context dependent. And I thought this was okay. Like on paper, this looked pretty good, but in game, it was kind of awkward to just have the character disappear. I also experimented with this idea of having the character dialogue still be below the character. It was kind of something that made sense that the character in the screen, if I'm going to have a portrait on this floating box, that they would be behind it and that it would be below them so that they were sort of almost like sitting at a desk. That was something that I thought was at least from a UX perspective and like a layout perspective, it looked good, like it feels good. But then the question is, okay, but where does it live? I even thought about the idea of just pinning it to the bottom of the screen and having it be like super ginormous. I don't hate this idea, but this is quite a large portrait at this point. So I settled for a while on this view, right? As long as we've got like a little bit of extra space to the left and right of the character, we can actually just put the portrait right next to them and have the dialogue little pip here live beneath the character. This was what I prototyped, and I had this playing in the game up until about a week ago, from basically all of August until like last week. And it was good. The final sort of nail in the coffin though was even this system, like even though it's more flexible and can be placed anywhere on screen, it does have this kind of like rectangle of influence, right? That ends up being again like a third of the screen. If you were to take, this big no-go zone that's created by the dialogue box, you're sort of committing to at least this much of the screen being gone. So if there is any character that's living here, or that's, you know, anything that's next to here, whenever this character talks, you lose that one. It's not great, particularly in its height. And this became really clear as I was working in a scene that I'll show you now, actually. So this is the final version of the system as it exists right now. And you can see I've moved the portraits off to the right. I'll go into that in a little bit, but I just want to show you the constraints of this scene first that led me to this design change. So you can see here we've got 3 characters and then a 4th that's standing, you know, much higher up. This is really using all of the screen real estate at this point, right? And they're actually really close to each other as well. Like if this guy's talking, Armin might be obscured by his dialogue. It also presents a challenge because we have characters at the extremes of the screen. So having there be the portrait sitting on top of the dialogue means that the entire middle section of the screen, like 50% of this middle, is basically taken up by the characters. And if we try to put that dialogue box above their heads, we're going to lose it for this character. And if it's below their bodies, we're going to lose it for all 3 of these guys. And so I kind of got to this scenario where there is an issue, right? Like something needed to change because it wasn't going to have the flexibility that I wanted it to if it worked the same for every character. It was at this point that I came up with an idea called the dialogue pin system. And the dialogue pin system is basically just a game object. It's an empty game object that contains a reference to a portrait. And when the system is playing, it effectively just says, okay, like who's talking, place the dialogue system over the pin of the character who's talking. So when this guy is talking, this is his pin, his box shows up here. This was good, but having to supply this pin for every character was not great. I needed a default. I needed something that for most characters worked. And given the default view of the game, featuring the characters in the bottom third of the screen, it made sense that the default needed to be above their heads, right? Like why would I change it to be below them if the character is always standing here anyway? So then we go back to the drawing board. We come back to the same design challenge of, we have this dialogue portrait, it's above the dialogue. How do we streamline it? We pull it to the side. And you can see here, there are yet more challenges. So the more this system evolved, there were some added heuristics that needed to be concerned, right? So the older system was very simple and it had few features, right? It was very rigid, but that rigidity meant it was easy to implement. As I added constraints and things that needed to be a certain way, now the system needs to be much more flexible. There needs to be more rules governing how it works. So in this context, like if you just think about it, the position of this relative to the main character needs to be very careful, right? It still can't go above the screen. It still can't go off the sides of the screen. The text can't be behind the character. Like if the character's going to overlap, which I was really keen on, right? Like I really wanted to have the character overlap the dialogue box to visually ground it to it, right? If we keep this off to the side, there's so much empty space that you really don't visually connect it in a way that feels, it just doesn't feel very pleasant to look at. It's kind of just floating off. I wasn't very happy about this like random edge either. Like, why is his body just going into the ether? But I also didn't have a nice way of creating like a solid bottom either. You know, maybe we could have had the character's name there instead of where it was. So we had earlier on this idea of like this showing up. But I thought, you know what, like if I can make this work, then I will. Again, like best case scenario, we're actually taking up less of the height. We can put this wherever we want. We just need to make sure that it's always going to be in a place that works. So currently, I'm not actually using any dialogue pins for anyone other than this character, right? If we go here, this character is the only one who's got a dialogue pin. Every other character's dialogue appears programmatically, right? It's just procedural. So the rules are that I always try to put the dialogue system above the character's head. And I never have the system appear off the edge of the screen, right? It must live inside of the screen and it must be above the character's head. Now here's a really good example of that rule at play. Like this box ordinarily would want to be situated directly above this character, but it's not going off the edge of the screen, because if it was to be exactly above his head, it would go off the side. So what I've created is a bounding box. This red box here describes what we're allowed for this text box to leave. And the size of this box is really just the half of the width of the actual text. So the middle of the text can't go outside of this box. That's the middle there, and that's the edge of the box, because any further and we would actually breach the side of the screen. So it's just a bit of math to say, don't go off the edge. And that's the same for above and below, right? That's the top of the screen. The middle can't go beyond this point here. The way that I previously was determining which character, which side of the box the characters existed on was hard-coded. I was just like in my dialogue system editor saying left side or right side for each character. And I switched that for a system that essentially just looks at the way that the sprite is facing. So I don't try the left or right side of the screen. It's not the side that they're standing on. It's just replicating the side that the character is facing. And this makes sense, right? If this guy happened to be musing to himself off the side of the screen, looking to the left, you wouldn't want his portrait looking to the right. You'd want his portrait just looking where he's looking. So that's the way that I figured it out. So for as far as the positioning of the box, I was really happy with this feature set and this sort of procedural set of rules, because it effectively makes sure that we never have a bad positioning of the box. We can always have as much text as we want, and we maximize the amount of screen real estate that we're actually using. And for the price of just supplying like one additional game object transform, we can put the boxes wherever we want, even if it's a custom position. So if we take a look at our evolution so far, we've got version 1, which is very tall, requires portraits. Version 2 still requires portraits, but it's shorter. Then I had my tutorial tips and my pop-ups, and these did not require portraits all of the time. In this case, no portraits. And this one was much smaller. So I had these different front ends that solved different problems. But I realized that if I could just get the main system to be more lightweight, it could actually fit all three at once, right? If this system can be used with and without portraits, then I could use this for that. And I could use it for these as well with some modification. And that was the goal. So essentially, if I can just get the text to render in a nice way with or without the portraits, then we've successfully refactored the entire design basically down into one, which is ideal. Now to make that work, one really important feature, since I made it not locked to the bottom of the screen, was this idea of a pointer. Okay, and the pointer was there from the pop-ups, right? Because the pop-ups, again, don't have portraits, you need to know who's talking, so we need to point at who's talking. Now, in the scenario where we could place these wherever we want, the pointer couldn't just be a sprite. Because what happens if this box is not directly above the character? What happens if like the box is so far over to the right that the point above the character doesn't intersect with the box? Well, now we need something more procedural. So I resolved to use a sprite shape for the pointer. And a sprite shape is essentially a polygon where we define points and then it gets filled with a sprite that's tiled. So it's kind of like a masked out shape based on the polygon. I was really confident that this would work. I was pretty confident that I could get this going. It actually is working here. So if I was to take Armin in this scene, I think I should be able to move him around. It can't just be directly above his head if it's going over to the portrait, stuff like that. It kind of has to point to him from wherever it's based. And the way that I did that was, it kind of looks like this. Like we've got our box, we've got our internal margin that's invisible. We have our character's head. This point here, or this point here, wherever it is, we draw a line, and then this is the tip of the box, and then where this intersects here, we go out to the left, out to the right. That's our triangle. So that's kind of what I ended up with, right? The thing about this that I'm not 100% happy with was just how it looks in the game. So you can see here, I'm successfully doing some pixelation to make this work, but I don't love the jaggies that appear. It really doesn't feel professional that you have these like weird stair-stepped lines, to the point where I'm actually pretty sure that I won't use this system and that I'll just use the constraint of making sure that the characters are just always within the bounds of the box so that I can use a sprite. I know that sounds picky, but that's just the way that I feel about it. This can get really awkward at certain lengths where you get an extra pixel on the end that's like a little black outline. We'll see. I'm not 100% sure what I'll do with it, but if I can't get it to look clean, then I might not keep it at all. But it works, so there you go. And the final aspect was just dealing with the positioning of the text in the box. So the actual text is rendered differently, whether or not there is one line or less than a line's worth of text, and whether or not we have a portrait and what side that portrait's on. I won't go into too much detail about the challenges of this approach, but basically the issues that I had to solve with this come from the fact that you have to define either the box or the text first in order to know what needs to be resized to match what. Like when we say 4 lines of text, if we haven't decided the size of the box yet, how do we know it's going to take up 4 lines? And vice versa. If we have a bunch of text, how do we know how big the box needs to be to fit within 1 line or not? So I won't go into too much there, but there's a lot of kind of chicken and egg logic you have to solve first. It actually requires drawing the box and then drawing it a second time within 1 frame in order to adjust it so that it balances correctly. So that's it. That's the current system. You can see I did apply a little bit of logic here in the visual design of these characters, and I've got a procedural outline as well. So the black outline I think helps a lot. And this edge, essentially it's just like a 2x1 diagonal line that I actually kind of try to break up depending on the character's sprite. So in this case, we've got that 2x1 line, but the cravat, I don't know what the name of that is, the scarf thing actually like peeks over it, and so do his cloak. Obviously this sprite here is not final, it's from an old version, and I'm in the middle of this scene as far as design goes, so these don't match up, but he has like a big woolly Game of Thrones style cloak in the current designs. So you can see here some of that peeks over that edge. And I think that creates a nice frame. I think that creates a nice device there. We always have this line, but sometimes the character peeks over it. So that's the system as far as its design. You can see that even in the evolution of it, there's been quite a lot of consistency moving forward, right? So the idea of like the skeuomorphic elements, the pages with the folds and the shadows, have made their way pretty much throughout, right? We've still got this lighting. So we have the folds, we have the shadow, there are folds on either side, depending on which side the portrait's on. I've actually kept this little seam here. I think that's a really nice, that margin rule line is really nice that I've pulled from the pop-ups. Another advantage to this system is that we can actually have larger portraits. So I've gotten a little bit better at drawing portraits, and my workflow is a bit faster now as well. So in this scenario, we've actually won on like every level, right? Like the portraits can be bigger when we want them. The portraits don't take that much longer, and they definitely take less time than animating the characters. And for the characters who don't need to interact and don't need to emote, we can just nix the portrait altogether. I think I've basically arrived at something that's really, really functional and is appropriate for the game that Insignia has become. So I've talked you through how this thing was built. I now want to talk to you about whether or not this is something that we could have arrived at from the beginning. So coming back to the very beginning, when I think about this system and the things that I knew that I wanted from it and things that I didn't know I would want, it was very hard for me, looking back on it, to ask of myself to have been able to anticipate where I would need to be today. I don't think it's something that's realistic, right? My ambitions for the game weren't as high just in terms of the scope of what I thought a cutscene could involve and how I expected the characters to be positioned on screen and whether or not, I could control that positioning in an intelligent way. I wasn't at that point yet, right? It seemed like a safe decision to pin it to the bottom of the screen. And I think for the game that Insignia was, it made sense, right? For where I was as a developer, it made sense. Now, at this point, when I was thinking about this, there was no conversation about whether or not I was going to use this system for tutorials, right? So the addition later on of like this version and these pop-ups as well, these were incidental. Like, I don't think it's practical to try to think 2 years ahead and say, well, we're going to come into a scenario where we're going to have all these characters and we want to give them lines of dialogue, but we don't want the system to pause. Like it feels like speculation. And if you go down this road of trying to develop features in advance of needing them, then you might not even really know what it is that you're trying to solve with those systems, right? You might be speculating on what it is that you even want for those things to do. So as a process, it really has had to have been one that I discovered. It's very obvious to say things like, well, this is not great, right? Like taking up half of the screen's bad. Okay, sure. Maybe we could have gone to something like this straight off the bat. But it wasn't really obvious to me, even here, that, that we wouldn't want to have portraits on either side of the screen like this. There really weren't enough pieces of the puzzle evident for me to be able to figure this out. So I think the argument for creative discovery on the design side is quite a solid one. I think in general, across design, it's very much promoted and accepted that you expect to prototype things, you expect to implement them and to iterate on them based on the feedback that you get when you're testing them. That's something that I think a lot of designers would approve of in other fields. The question on the technology side is, does this create bloat in the game, right? Like, are you able to do this kind of exploration without increasing the actual development time of the project significantly? And I think this is something that, luckily, with this system, I've done quite a good job of. So this is one of the oldest systems in the game, but I've managed to develop it in such a way that every change that I made felt incremental and felt like it was an attachment on top, like an extension of the system, rather than a rewrite. I've never had to rewrite this system. So we can talk a little bit about the code side of this and how I think that you should aim to develop these kinds of systems to avoid the messy side of this iterative process. So here is one of the scripts. This is called Dialogue Engine. Okay. This script has one job. Okay. This script handles the playback of the text. It doesn't manage the animation. It doesn't manage the visual presentation of the text. It just manages playing back the text and telling the cutscene system when the player has pressed the button to proceed. Okay, so all it does is reveals the text. Now this system, since I built it, has had very little changes, right? Very little about this part of the functionality has changed at all, right? Every iteration has had text that scrolls. Changing the solution of the text box from Unity text box to Text Mesh Pro hasn't changed how this system works, really. Nothing about it has changed. And that's great, right? This is a single responsibility piece of code, and its behavior is modular, which is excellent. This code here is quite a large script, is called the sequence player. This handles the actual playback of the cutscenes in conjunction with timelines. So my dialogue systems, if you've been watching in the past, you'll know that the actual system itself handles a bit more than dialogue. From the editor side, not every line is dialogue. Some of these are sound effects that play. Some of these are messages, like functions that get called. Some of them are animation cues. So, to make a character, animate a certain way after a certain line of dialogue has been played. And this system has had lots of change. but it hasn't needed to update the dialogue engine. Those two classes don't really interact with each other in such a way that changing one forces a change on the other. The dependencies are separate. All this needs to do is tell the dialogue system, hey, play this event, right? We've got some text, we've got a character portrait. I want you to play it and I want you to put the box here, right? And so any other changes we've made about whether or not this thing syncs up with a timeline, how many different kinds of events that there are, that doesn't change the system because those things don't relate back to dialogue. Now, the code that has changed is the presentation code. So the very, very front end that manages, those little bookmarks popping up and down, the transparency, whether or not the system pushes the camera up, those are what I call like the front end layer, and they're called dialogue targets. So there's one called dialogue page, right? This was the original one. I don't use this class anymore, or at least it's turned off. There's no game objects that use it. So when I replaced this, what I did was I replaced it with an interface, and that interface is called dialogue target. And dialogue target just has a few basically hooks that the dialogue engine can point to, and these all relate to presentation, right? So focusing a character versus focusing on a different character, clearing the text, hiding or moving the box on screen, setting character names, that kind of stuff. That's all handled here in the target, right? This is the output. And there are different versions of this. So floating dialogue is the current dialogue target that I'll be using for pretty much everything from now on. And that's the one that you can see here. This is the floating dialogue. Now, floating dialogue's code, again, it has references to things like the pointer, because this is the only version that has a pointer. The version with the book that was pinned to the bottom of the screen didn't have a pointer, so there's no description for it. This is the system, right? And this is what makes it so easy to extend, is the fact that it's so modular, right? Most of these changes that we've been talking about are front-end display changes to how the system works. And so if the thing that's changing is the display, well, we don't need to throw out all of the other code. We just need, assuming that display code is in a class, we're just replacing that class. And because we're implementing an interface, most of the features and the expectations of what this thing can do, those are already set. So we just need to implement those functions for a new kind of dialogue target. Now, there are a couple of little things that have come up in this system over the course of the development that haven't been design changes. They're actually feature additions that I can just talk about very quickly. So one is the fact that the different characters have instance data that relates to a character. So we've got Armin here, we've got his portraits, but we've also got a thing called a pitch. And the pitch is the pitch that the little text blip makes when this character is talking. So there's this kind of like blip, 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 when a character is talking. The pitch of that is controlled on a per character basis. This could be swapped out later with a custom sound effect for each character. I'm not sure if I want to go down that road entirely, the full like Undertale, sans thing. But that functionality is there because it's defined in an object that I can just add to, right, whenever I want. So right now, every character has a pitch, but I could give every character a sound file, and that wouldn't be a problem. Another addition to this system is the addition of colored text. So Text Mesh Pro allows you to style your text arbitrarily, and you can actually create styles that create kind of like a CSS styling, right? It's kind of like HTML. So here I have these ideas for things like objects, which have a certain color, places have a certain color, actions have a certain color. So if a character is talking about a place that they want you to go, that place might be colored in purple, or if there's an action, that might be red. And that's just to kind of flag to the player, if they happen to be the kind of player that likes to spam the text, that, hey, this piece of text has some color in it, so you should at least look at this line of dialogue rather than just skipping through it all. Hopefully, that makes people more likely to read it. One other change that I've made since the beginning is, and this is something that's gone into the engine, is pacing for the dialogue. So when the dialogue is actually reading the text, it picks up whenever it sees punctuation. And if it sees punctuation, the actual pace that it reads at stops for just a moment. And what that does is it makes the text look like it's being read out, right? If it sees a comma, it pauses just briefly for a comma. If it sees a full stop or a period, it pauses for that period. If there's any ellipsis, it pauses even longer. And again, this is something that was pretty trivial to add. And because we've got these separate systems, like the dialogue engine that controls this stuff versus the front end, every front end receives this functionality because it's not defined in the front end, right? It's defined in the dialogue engine. One future feature that I'd like to add is the ability to change the actual vertex offsets of the lines of dialogue. So if one character is saying, "Oh, it's spooky," you know, being able to shake the letters of the word spooky would be kind of cool. And I'm not really concerned about the time that it would take to add that because it doesn't affect anything else. So I hope I've hammered home that point enough. Let's do some wrap-ups. So, designing this system has been very, very iterative and something that I've had a lot of joy coming back to once every couple of years. The game is such a growing project and its needs are being kind of like revealed as I work on it. I think at this stage, I'm probably at the point where I can't see this becoming any more streamlined than it is. Like, there's just nothing that I could imagine that a dialogue system could do that this one doesn't do at this point. But I think it's important to note that I got here in a very organic way, right? I only added features when they became apparent. I streamlined it when I felt like I had motivations to do that. And so I don't really think of those changes as like taking back my design or admitting to a fault. I don't think that's a really functional way of thinking about this kind of stuff. I think at the end of the day, like, you spend the time that you spend adding functionality and then streamlining it back down. That's a healthy part of the process. So that's the dialogue system. I hope that's been enough information for you. And if you'd like any more sort of like specifics about how it actually does what it does, we could talk about that too. But honestly, these kind of systems have been well worn as far as like their functionality goes. Like, revealing text is very, very trivial to do, and you'll find dozens of tutorials on YouTube that teach you how to do that. Still, if you want me to be the one to tell you how to do it, let me know, because it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. It's hard for me to know if my audience wants more of a sort of like code breakdown, or if you'd like to keep things more in the devlog space, or if you'd like me to just do pixel art tutorials. It's up to you guys. So let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. Hey pal, thanks for watching, and thanks most especially to the patrons and Twitch subs who support this channel and my game dev project Insignia. To find out more, click the links in the description below. And if you like this video, tell YouTube by clicking the like button, and then YouTube will tell me, and then I'll make more videos. That's nice. Thanks again, and until next time.